The nurse arrived to care for the millionaire's sick father in his mansion. She froze upon seeing her mother's photo in a black frame. Sarah Miller drove up the long, winding road leading to the Williams estate, the tires of her small car crunching on the gravel as she approached the towering iron gates. She'd heard about the mansion before. Everyone in the city knew of the Walkers, especially Michael Walker, the powerful businessman who ran the family empire. But today, she wasn't here to admire the wealth or status. She was here for a job, to care for James Walker, Michael's ailing father. The gates creaked open slowly, as if even they were too old and tired to perform their duties. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel, feeling a twinge of unease. She shook it off. It was just another job, she told herself. She had worked as a nurse for years and cared for patients from all walks of life. This would be no different. The mansion loomed ahead, its tall, gray walls framed by perfectly manicured gardens. As she parked and stepped out, the air around her felt heavy, thick with an odd mix of anticipation and an unsettling quiet. She rang the doorbell and waited, her eyes drifting across the grand front yard, trying to take in the sheer size of the place. A man in his late 30s opened the door, his sharp suit and stoic expression immediately identifying him as Michael Walker. He extended his hand. "You must be Sarah." "That's right," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, but his gaze didn't linger. He seemed distant, distracted. "Let me show you to my father," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The inside of the house was even grander than the outside. Marble floors gleamed beneath large chandeliers, and the walls were lined with ornate paintings and antiques. It felt like stepping into a museum, not a home. "Follow me," Michael said, leading her through a maze of hallways. The further they walked, the more Sarah felt a strange sense of disconnect, as if she didn't quite belong here. Like this mansion had its own secrets hidden in its shadowy corners. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a large bedroom where James Walker lay in bed, frail and pale. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow. Sarah immediately switched into her professional mode, observing the medical equipment surrounding him and assessing his condition. "I'll leave you to get settled," Michael said abruptly, turning to leave. "If you need anything, just ask one of the staff." Sarah nodded, though she sensed that Michael wasn't particularly interested in how she'd managed the situation. It was as if his mind was elsewhere, somewhere far from this house and far from the man lying in the bed. Once alone, Sarah unpacked her things, arranging them methodically. But as she moved about the room, something on a small table by the window caught her eye. It was a photograph, framed in black. She walked over to take a closer look, her breath catching in her throat. The woman in the photo was young, with a warm, radiant smile. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and there was something about her eyes, a familiarity that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She couldn't look away. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to touch the frame. It was her mother. There was no mistaking it. The woman in the photo, young and carefree, was the mother she had grown up with, the one who had never spoken much about her past. Sarah's mind raced. Why was her mother's photo here, in the Walker mansion? What possible connection could she have had with this family? The door creaked open, and Sarah jumped, snapping her hand away from the frame as Michael stepped back into the room. "Is everything all right?" he asked, noticing the shift in her expression. Sarah hesitated for a moment, the questions swirling in her mind. Who is this?" she finally asked, pointing to the photo. Michael's eyes followed her finger to the picture. For a brief moment, his expression softened, but then it hardened again. Guarded. That was someone I knew a long time ago," he said quietly. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Her name. What was her name? Her name was Maria, Michael replied, his voice distant. He stared at the photo for a moment longer before turning back to Sarah. "She was a housekeeper here, years ago. We were close." Sarah's throat went dry. Her mother had never mentioned working for a wealthy family. She had never mentioned anything about this place. I don't understand," Sarah stammered. "That's my mother." Michael froze. For the first time since she had arrived, his composed demeanor cracked. His eyes widened as he stared at her in disbelief. "What did you say?" "That's my mother," Sarah repeated, her voice shaky but firm. "That woman in the photo, that's Maria Miller. She's my mom." Michael took a step back, his face draining of color. "That can't be..." But Sarah knew it was true. And as the weight of the revelation sank in, she realized that her simple job as a nurse in this mansion had just turned into something far more complicated and far more personal. Michael stood there, frozen in place, as if Sarah's words had physically struck him. The disbelief etched on his face was unmistakable, but behind his shocked expression, there was something else, a deep sadness that he hadn't quite hidden. Sarah, still reeling from her own discovery, struggled to keep her composure. 1,000 questions raced through her mind, none of them making sense. How could her mother, who had never once mentioned a wealthy family, let alone the Walkers, have been connected to this place, this man? Michael finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "Are you sure? This can't be... Maria, she disappeared years ago. No one knew what happened to her." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She was certain. "I'm sure my mother's name was Maria Miller, and that's her in the picture." Her voice wavered slightly, but the certainty in her words was undeniable. Michael blinked, as though trying to process the enormity of what she had just said. He walked over to the photo, picking it up with trembling hands. His eyes lingered on the image of Maria, lost in thought, before he turned back to Sarah. "Your mother. She never mentioned this place. Never mentioned me?" Sarah shook her head slowly, her own shock mirrored in her expression. "No. She never talked much about her past. I didn't even know she had worked for you." Michael's jaw tightened, and he placed the photo back on the table carefully, as if it were a fragile relic of a time long gone. We were very close once," he murmured, his voice heavy with unspoken memories. "But she left without a word. I searched for her for years, but she was just gone." The silence between them thickened, the weight of Michael's words sinking in. Sarah couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. She had grown up with her mother, a woman who, though kind and caring, had always seemed to carry an air of mystery, especially about her younger years. Now, standing in the very mansion where her mother had once worked, Sarah felt like she had stepped into a hidden chapter of her mother's life, one she never even knew existed. "Why would she leave?" Sarah asked softly, more to herself than to Michael. "What happened between you two?" Michael exhaled slowly, leaning against the edge of the desk, his gaze far away. I don't know," he admitted, his tone defeated. "We were young. She was a housekeeper here, and I was the son of a wealthy man. We cared for each other, but my father..." His voice trailed off, and his eyes darkened at the mention of his father. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Your father? Did he know about the two of you?" Michael gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, he knew. He always knew. But he made it clear that someone like Maria wasn't acceptable." His words were laced with a quiet anger, and for the first time, Sarah saw a glimpse of the tension that had likely existed between Michael and his father for years. A knot formed in Sarah's stomach. The more Michael spoke, the more she realized that her mother's disappearance wasn't as simple as she had once thought. There was something more here, something tied to the Walkers and their wealth, and to James Walker, a man who had now become her patient. "Your father," Sarah said slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Did he do something? Did he make her leave?" Michael's eyes flickered with something that looked like guilt. but he quickly masked it. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight. "I've always suspected, but I never had proof." He was a controlling man, especially when it came to family matters. He made it clear that Maria wasn't part of the future he had planned for me. Sarah's chest tightened as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Her mother's sudden disappearance, the lack of any mention of her past with the Walkers, and now, this revelation. It wasn't hard to imagine that James Walker had played a role in forcing her mother to leave, ensuring that any relationship between her and Michael was erased. "I need to talk to him," Sarah said abruptly, her voice stronger now. "Your father. I need to know what he did." Michael looked at her sharply. "James is not in a good state. I'm not sure if he even remembers much." "I don't care," Sarah replied, her resolve hardening. "I need answers. If he was involved in my mother's disappearance, I need to know, and he's the only one who can tell me." Michael studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he gestured toward the hallway. "He's in the East Wing. But Sarah, be careful. My father isn't the man he used to be. He's different now." Sarah nodded, though the warning did little to temper the fire burning inside her. She turned and walked toward the East Wing, her mind racing. The idea that James Walker had been responsible for tearing her mother away from her life with Michael was almost too much to bear, and yet, deep down, Sarah knew it was likely true. As she approached the large double doors leading to James Walker's room, she took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding, her palms sweaty, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating all at once. She knocked softly on the door before opening it, stepping inside the dimly lit room. There, lying in the large bed, was James Walker, the man who held the key to all the answers she desperately needed. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp on the bedside table. James Walker lay still, his frail body barely moving with the slow rise and fall of his shallow breaths. He seemed so much smaller than the man she'd imagined, a shadow of the powerful figure Michael had described. Sarah stood at the door for a moment, her heart racing in her chest. She had come here for answers, but now that she was standing in front of him, she wasn't sure where to begin. This man, bedridden and pale, didn't seem like the same person who might have driven her mother away all those years ago. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, pulling a chair closer to his bed and sitting down quietly. The air in the room was thick with the scent of antiseptics and medication, reminding her of the many hospital rooms she had worked in over the years. But this was different. This was personal. "Mr. Walker?" Sarah spoke softly, unsure if he would even hear her. His eyes fluttered open slightly, though they didn't focus on her right away. "Mr. Walker, can you hear me?" His head turned slowly, and his eyes eventually settled on her, though it was clear he was struggling to make sense of who she was. "Who are you?" His voice was raspy, weak. Sarah leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice calm. "My name is Sarah Miller. I'm here to care for you." She paused, searching his face for any recognition. "But there's something else I need to ask you about." James blinked slowly, his confusion evident. "Miller?" he murmured, as if the name stirred something in his memory. His gaze sharpened just a fraction. "Maria Miller?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He remembered. He knew her mother's name. "Yes," she said quickly, her voice a little louder now. "Maria Miller was my mother. You knew her, didn't you?" For a moment, James just stared at her, his face blank. Then, slowly, something flickered in his expression. A recognition. Maybe even guilt. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but the words didn't come right away. I knew her," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "She worked here, a long time ago." Sarah felt a surge of frustration, but she held it back. She needed to be patient. "Yes, "I know that," she said softly, but with urgency in her tone. "What I don't know is why she left, why she disappeared without a word." James's eyes grew distant, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if he even remembered what had happened all those years ago. But then his face tightened, and a shadow of regret passed over his features. "I made sure she left," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I had to." Sarah's stomach churned. She had suspected as much, but hearing him say it out loud was like a punch to the gut. "Why?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why would you do that? What did she ever do to you?" James's eyes flicked to hers, and for a brief moment, the frail man in the bed looked almost defiant, as if he were still clinging to the power he once held. "She wasn't right for my son," he muttered. "She wasn't part of this world. I couldn't allow it." Sarah clenched her fists, her anger rising. "So you just forced her out? Made her disappear? She had a life, a daughter. You didn't care about that." James didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the ceiling, as if he were replaying old memories in his mind. "I thought I was protecting him," he said quietly. "Michael, he was supposed to marry someone from a good family, someone who could help with the business, the legacy." His voice grew fainter, as if the weight of his own words were too much for him to bear. Maria was an obstacle. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Her mother, the kind woman who had raised her, had been nothing more than an inconvenience to this man. The anger bubbled up inside her, but she forced herself to stay composed. She needed more answers. "So you just got rid of her," Sarah said, her voice cold. "You didn't care what happened to her." James's breath hitched, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might have broken down in tears, but instead, he turned his head away from her, as if ashamed. "I did what I thought was right," he murmured. "I thought, if she was gone, Michael would forget her. Move on." Sarah's chest tightened. "And did he?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did he move on?" James didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. Michael hadn't moved on. He had carried the weight of his lost love for years, just as her mother had likely carried the pain of being torn from the man she loved. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick between them. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to process everything James had told her. Her mother had been driven away, not because of anything she had done, but because she wasn't deemed good enough for this world, for this family. It was infuriating, heartbreaking. Finally, she stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. "You had no right," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "No right to take her life away like that." James didn't respond. His eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow. It was clear that their conversation had taken a toll on him. But Sarah wasn't done. She had the answers she needed, but they didn't bring her any comfort. Instead, they left her feeling hollow, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She turned and left the room, her mind spinning with questions about what to do next. As she stepped back into the hallway, she nearly bumped into Michael, who had clearly been waiting just outside. His eyes searched her face, filled with concern. "What did he say?" Sarah looked at him, her emotions still raw. "He admitted it," she said quietly. "He made her leave. He thought he was doing it for you." Michael's face tightened, a flicker of pain crossing his features. "I had a feeling," he muttered, but hearing it. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The truth had been revealed, but it didn't bring the closure either of them had hoped for. Instead, it left them both feeling more lost than ever. Michael stood in silence after hearing Sarah's words, his expression a mixture of disbelief and a growing sense of betrayal. The revelation about his father's actions wasn't entirely unexpected, but having it confirmed struck him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had spent years grappling with the unexplained absence of Maria, the woman he had loved deeply. And now, knowing that it was his own father who had torn them apart, it left a wound that felt impossible to heal. "I need to speak with him," Michael muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "He's not in good shape," Sarah replied softly, her own emotions still raw from the conversation she'd just had with James. "I don't know if he's capable of explaining much more." Michael's gaze hardened, his jaw clenched as he looked past Sarah toward his father's room. "I don't care. He owes me the truth." Without waiting for a response, Michael strode down the hall toward the door, leaving Sarah standing alone in the corridor. She watched him go, a part of her understanding his need for answers, but another part worried about what this confrontation would bring. She had already heard enough to know that whatever Michael found in that room, it wouldn't be the closure he was hoping for. Michael pushed the door open and stepped inside. James was lying there, just as Sarah had left him, his eyes closed, his breathing labored. For a brief moment, Michael hesitated. This frail old man, weakened by time and illness, hardly seemed capable of the cruelty that had shattered his life so many years ago. But then, the anger surged again, and Michael moved closer to the bed. "Dad," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "Wake up. We need to talk." James stirred, his eyelids fluttering as he slowly opened his eyes. It took him a moment to focus on the figure looming over him, but when he did, his expression flickered with something resembling regret. "Michael." James's voice was barely a whisper, raspy and weak. "I just spoke with Sarah," Michael said, crossing his arms. "She's Maria's daughter. And you?" His voice caught in his throat, and he had to swallow the bitterness that was rising within him. "You made her leave? You drove her away? Why?" James's face tightened, his brow furrowing as he struggled to form words. "I did what I thought was best," he said after a long pause, his voice strained. "You were supposed to have a future that didn't include her." Michael's hands balled into fists at his sides. "You destroyed my future," he snapped. "You destroyed us." James's eyes filled with pain, and he let out a long, shaky breath. "You were so young, so blinded by your feelings. She was a distraction. I needed you focused on the business, on your responsibilities. She would have ruined everything." Michael shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You were more concerned about your legacy than you were about your own son." "I was protecting you," James said, his voice growing weaker with each word. "You don't understand." "Protecting me?" Michael scoffed, leaning closer, his voice shaking with anger. "You didn't protect me. You took away the one thing that mattered to me." The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with all the years of unsaid words between them. Michael stood over his father, his heart pounding, the anger bubbling up from years of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. "I loved her," Michael continued, his voice low but full of emotion. "I loved her. And you?" "I know," James interrupted, his eyes filled with regret. "I know you loved her, but love wasn't enough. Not for this family. Not for what I had built. I needed you to see that. I needed you to understand." Michael's throat tightened, his vision blurring with the onset of tears he hadn't expected. For years, he had wondered what had happened, why Maria had vanished without a trace, and now, hearing that it had been his father's hand behind it all, it felt like a betrayal so deep, so unforgivable, that he didn't know how to move forward. "You were wrong," Michael said finally, his voice breaking. "You were so wrong." James's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling with effort. He looked up at his son, the weight of his guilt clear on his face. "Maybe I was," he whispered, "but I did what I thought was right, at the time." Michael stared at him, his mind spinning. He had spent so many years blaming himself, thinking maybe Maria had left because of something he had done, something he hadn't been able to give her. And now, it turned out that his father had taken that choice away from both of them. The realization hit him like a wave, drowning him in a sense of loss that he hadn't fully comprehended until now. "I need you to understand, Michael," James said, his voice fading as his strength waned. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Michael's heart ached with the weight of those words, but they felt hollow, too little, too late. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. He wanted to forgive his father, to find some way to release the anger that had been eating at him for so long. But standing there, looking down at the man who had single-handedly destroyed the life he could have had, it was impossible. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Michael said quietly, the words heavy with finality. James closed his eyes, his expression filled with sorrow. I know." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Michael stood there for what felt like an eternity, his emotions swirling inside him like a storm he couldn't control. He had come for answers, and now that he had them, all he felt was emptiness. Finally, he turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy as he walked back into the hall. Sarah was waiting for him, her face a mixture of concern and understanding. "Well?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his for some kind of resolution. Michael shook his head, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his shoulders. He admitted it. He did it. All of it. Sarah's expression tightened, and she nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." Michael let out a long, shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do with all of this." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him in the moment. "We'll figure it out," she said gently, "together." And for the first time in years, Michael felt a flicker of hope. The hallway felt suffocating as Michael and Sarah stood in silence, the weight of the recent revelations hanging heavily in the air. Michael's mind raced, trying to process everything his father had confessed. The truth had been buried for so many years, and now that it was out, the emotional toll was more than he had expected. Sarah glanced up at him, her face a mixture of empathy and unease. She had her own emotions to grapple with, the realization that her mother had been torn away from the life she could have had, and that Michael, the man standing beside her, was at the center of it all. "So, what now?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but steady. Michael exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice strained. "I've spent years wondering why she left, why she disappeared without a word. And now I know it wasn't her choice. It was him." He clenched his jaw, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "But knowing the truth doesn't make it any easier." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant as she processed her own thoughts. "It's the same for me. I grew up not knowing why my mother kept her past a secret. She never talked about this place, about you." She paused, her brow furrowing as she thought back to her childhood. Maybe she thought it was better that way. Maybe she didn't want me to know what had been taken from her. Michael's gaze softened as he looked at her. "She was protecting you," he said, his voice gentler now, "from all of this, from my family's mess." The word mess seemed to hang in the air, too small to describe the magnitude of what had been done. Michael's father had stolen years from both of them, years that they could never get back. And now, here they were, standing in the aftermath of a truth that had only brought more questions and pain. Michael let out a shaky breath and ran his fingers through his hair. "I've spent so long angry at her," he said quietly. "I thought she had just left me, abandoned everything we had. But she didn't. She couldn't." Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. "It wasn't her fault," she said softly. "None of this was her fault. Michael's eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment, the anger in him seemed to dissipate, replaced by something else, a deep, aching sadness. "I just don't know what to do now," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "How am I supposed to move on from this?" Sarah swallowed hard. She understood the weight of his words all too well. She was struggling with the same questions. "We can't change the past," she said after a long pause. "But we can decide what to do with the future." Michael nodded slowly, but the uncertainty in his eyes remained. The future seemed like a distant, unreachable thing at that moment. Overshadowed by the past, they were both forced to confront. "I need time," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Time to process all of this." Sarah nodded in understanding. "I think we both do." The quiet between them stretched on, neither one knowing exactly what to say or how to move forward. The weight of their shared history, of the choices made by the generation before them, felt heavy, almost impossible to bear. Finally, Michael turned to face her fully. "Look, I know this isn't easy for you either," he said, his voice softer now. "Finding out that your mother was forced to leave, that she had a whole life she never told you about, it must be overwhelming." Sarah let out a small, bitter laugh. "Overwhelming doesn't even begin to describe it," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "I feel like I don't even know who she was anymore, like everything she told me was just a piece of the truth." Michael's eyes filled with empathy. "Maybe she was just trying to protect you," he said gently. "She didn't want you to grow up with all this pain." Sarah nodded slowly, but the ache in her chest didn't lessen. "Maybe," she whispered, "but it still hurts." Michael sighed, his shoulders slumping as the exhaustion of the last few hours finally caught up with him. "I know it does," he said quietly, "for both of us." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, interrupting their conversation. One of the house staff appeared, looking slightly uncomfortable as she approached them. "Mr. Walker," she said tentatively, glancing between Michael and Sarah. "Your father, he's asking for you." Michael's expression tightened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might refuse to go back into the room. But then he let out a long breath and nodded. "I'll be there in a minute," he said, his voice weary. The staff member gave a small nod and disappeared back down the hall. Sarah watched as Michael turned toward his father's room, a storm of emotions flickering across his face. "Are you going to talk to him again?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Michael hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "Not yet." Sarah nodded, understanding the conflict he was feeling. She, too, had found it difficult to face James again after their earlier conversation. There was something about the finality of his confession, the way he had admitted to orchestrating everything, that made it hard to be in the same room as him. The guilt he carried was evident, but it didn't erase the damage he had done. Michael turned to her, his eyes searching hers for a moment. "What about you?" he asked. Do you think you'll be able to forgive him?" Sarah's chest tightened at the question. Forgiveness seemed like such an abstract concept right now, especially when the wounds were still so fresh. "I don't know," she admitted. "I honestly don't know if I can." Michael nodded, his expression reflecting the same uncertainty. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I get that." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the tension between them shifting. It wasn't the tension of strangers anymore. It was the tension of two people who had been thrust into each other's lives by forces beyond their control. Two people who were now bound by the same painful truth. Finally, Michael straightened, glancing back down the hall toward his father's room. "I should go check on him," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Sarah gave him a small nod. "Go ahead. I'll be here if you need me." Michael hesitated. his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he nodded and turned to walk back down the hallway. Sarah watched him go, her heart heavy with everything they had uncovered. As Michael disappeared around the corner, Sarah leaned back against the wall, letting out a long breath. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences of that truth were far from over. She had no idea what the future held for her or for Michael, but she knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, the mansion felt heavier than usual. The air inside seemed to cling to Sarah as she moved through the long, dimly lit hallways. She had barely slept after everything that had happened the day before. Her mind had been racing with the revelations about her mother and the weight of James Walker's confession. There was no way to ignore it now. Her life had been forever intertwined with the Walkers, and there was still so much she didn't know. Sarah found herself in the kitchen, sipping on a cup of coffee and staring out the large bay window at the garden. The perfectly manicured grounds contrasted sharply with the chaos she felt inside. She knew she couldn't rest until she had more answers, until she knew the full truth about why her mother had disappeared so abruptly from this world. Michael had been up before her, already meeting with one of his father's attorneys in the study. The tension in the house was palpable, and she could tell that Michael was struggling to manage his emotions while also dealing with the practical realities of his father's declining health and the business. As Sarah finished her coffee, she made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to take control of the situation, to find out more about her mother's past in this house. There were still so many unanswered questions that only the people who had worked here back then could answer. She knew the mansion had retained many of the same staff for years. There had to be someone, an older housekeeper or groundskeeper, who remembered her mother. Someone who could fill in the gaps. Determined, Sarah left the kitchen and made her way through the halls until she found Mrs. Harper, the head housekeeper, arranging flowers in one of the sitting rooms. Mrs. Harper was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. If anyone knew the details of what had happened in this house years ago, it would be her. "Mrs. Harper?" Sarah began, her voice steady but laced with tension. The housekeeper turned, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, Miss Miller." Sarah swallowed, gathering her thoughts. I need to ask you something about my mother." Mrs. Harper's expression softened slightly, though she remained guarded. "Your mother?" "Oh, yes, Maria, wasn't it?" Sarah nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, Maria Miller. You worked here when she did, didn't you?" Mrs. Harper's eyes flickered with recognition, and she set the vase down on the table with a sigh. "Yes, I remember Maria," she said quietly. "She was one of the best housekeepers we ever had. A lovely woman." Sarah stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly. What happened to her? Why did she leave? Was it really because of him? She couldn't bring herself to say James's name, but Mrs. Harper seemed to understand. The older woman let out a long breath, glancing down at the flowers for a moment before looking back at Sarah. "There were rumors," Mrs. Harper said carefully. "But I don't know everything. What I do know is that Maria was, well, she was caught up in something much bigger than herself." Sarah's chest tightened. "Caught up in what?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "You have to understand back then Mr. Walker, James Walker, had very specific ideas about how things should be run. He didn't tolerate anything that might upset the family's reputation. And when he found out about Maria and Michael, well, let's just say he didn't take it well." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "So, he made her leave?" Mrs. Harper nodded slowly. "That's what I always believed. One day, Maria was here, doing her job, and the next, she was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. It wasn't like her. But we all knew better than to ask questions." Sarah felt a wave of sadness wash over her. Her mother had been forced out of her life, not by her own choice, but by the manipulation of a powerful man who cared more about appearances than the happiness of those around him. "Did you ever hear from her again?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Harper shook her head. No, she just vanished. I always wondered what happened to her. Sarah blinked back tears. The pain of losing her mother had always been there, simmering just beneath the surface. But now it felt more raw, more real. She had been cheated out of a life her mother might have wanted for her, all because of the selfishness of one man. Thank you, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with emotion. Thank you for telling me. Mrs. Harper gave her a sad smile. I'm sorry, dear. I wish I had more answers for you. With a heavy heart, Sarah left the sitting room and made her way back through the mansion, her mind swirling with thoughts. She now understood just how deep the damage went, how much had been lost because of decisions made by people who had cared more about their reputation than the lives of those around them. She passed by Michael's study on her way to the back garden and paused as she heard raised voices coming from inside. Curiosity got the better of her, and she hesitated for a moment before stepping closer to the slightly ajar door. Inside, she could hear Michael speaking with someone, likely the attorney. His voice was sharp, frustrated, and filled with a bitterness that hadn't been there before. I don't care about the business right now, Michael snapped. My father's legacy isn't what matters to me. Not after everything he's done. The attorney's voice was calm, measured. I understand, Mr. Walker, but you need to think about the company's future. Your father's health is failing, and decisions will have to be made. I'll make the decisions when I'm ready, Michael shot back. But don't expect me to do it out of some sense of obligation to him. He lost that right when he took everything from me. Sarah's heart ached as she listened to Michael's words. He was carrying so much pain, so much anger, and she knew it wasn't just about the business. It was about his father's betrayal, the life he could have had, the love he had lost. As she turned to leave, she felt a pang of guilt. She had her own struggles to deal with, her own grief. But hearing Michael's frustration reminded her that they were both trapped in this web of secrets and lies. Both of them had been hurt by the same man, and both of them were struggling to figure out how to move forward. Out in the garden, Sarah sat on one of the stone benches, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet calm her racing thoughts. The answers she had found today hadn't brought her the peace she had hoped for. If anything, they had left her feeling more lost than ever. The truth had come out, but now she had to figure out what to do with it. The days following Sarah's conversation with Mrs. Harper felt like a blur of confusion and unresolved emotions. Every corner of the Walker mansion seemed to hold another painful memory, another echo of a life her mother had kept hidden. Sarah found herself retreating to the garden more often, seeking some kind of solace in the quiet beauty of the outdoors. But no matter how peaceful the surroundings, the turmoil inside her remained. She hadn't spoken much to Michael since their brief conversation outside his father's room. He had been buried in meetings with lawyers and business advisors, trying to juggle his responsibilities while grappling with the devastating truths that had come to light. And yet, Sarah could sense the weight of their shared history pulling at him, just as it pulled at her. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the stone bench beneath a large oak tree, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Michael walking toward her, his expression weary but determined. He had dark circles under his eyes, a clear sign that sleep had been a stranger to him too. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft. Sarah shook her head. Of course not. Michael sat down beside her, exhaling heavily as he leaned back against the bench. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content to let the silence stretch between them. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, unasked questions, and the weight of everything they had uncovered. "I've been thinking," Michael said finally, breaking the quiet, "about everything that's happened, about what my father did, and about your mother." Sarah glanced at him, noting the sadness in his eyes. "What have you been thinking?" Michael let out a dry laugh. "That I'm not sure what to do next," he admitted. I thought finding out the truth would give me some kind of closure, but it hasn't. If anything, it's only made things more complicated." Sarah nodded, understanding all too well what he meant. "I feel the same way," she said quietly. "I thought knowing what happened to my mom would bring me peace, but now I just feel lost, like I don't know where I fit in this whole story." Michael frowned, his brow furrowing. "It's not your fault, Sarah. None of this is. It's all on my father. He's the one who made those decisions, who took everything from both of us." "I know," Sarah said, her voice tight. "But that doesn't make it any easier to deal with. I grew up thinking my mother was just gone, that she had left for reasons I would never understand. And now, knowing that she didn't have a choice in the matter, it just makes me wonder what kind of life she could have had. What kind of life we could have had." Michael turned to face her, his expression filled with empathy. "I've been wondering the same thing," he admitted. "If my father hadn't interfered, if Maria had stayed, maybe things would have been different for both of us." The what-ifs hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. It was impossible not to think about the lives they could have lived if James hadn't destroyed everything in his quest to control the future. Sarah sighed, leaning forward and resting her elbows on her knees. "I can't stop thinking about her," she said softly. "What she must have gone through after she left. How scared and alone she must have been." Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle and reassuring. "She wasn't alone," he said quietly. "She had you." Sarah's chest tightened at his words. It was true. Her mother had raised her, had given her a good life despite everything. But it didn't erase the pain of knowing that her mother had been torn away from the love she had found, forced to start over in a life that wasn't meant to be hers. "I know," Sarah whispered. "But it still hurts." Michael's hand lingered on her shoulder for a moment before he withdrew it, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything my family did to yours. If I could change it, I would." Sarah shook her head, blinking back tears. "You're not responsible for your father's actions, Michael. It's not your fault." Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "It feels like it is," he admitted. "Because I couldn't stop him. I couldn't protect her. And now, it's too late." The silence that followed was thick with unresolved tension. Sarah could see the guilt weighing on Michael, the regret that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He had been just as much a victim of James Walker's control as her mother had been. But the scars of that betrayal ran deep. As they sat there, side by side, Sarah couldn't help but think about how their lives had been shaped by decisions they hadn't made, by the choices of others, choices they had been powerless to stop. And now, all they had left were the pieces of a broken past, scattered and difficult to piece together. "I've been thinking about something else, too," Michael said after a long pause, his voice hesitant. "What is it?" Sarah asked, turning to look at him. Michael hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "I've been thinking about my father," he said slowly. "About what he did, and whether or not I should forgive him." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was a question she had been grappling with herself, though in a different way. Could she forgive James Walker for what he had done to her mother? Could she find it in her heart to let go of the anger and the pain that had been festering since she learned the truth? "I don't know if I can," Michael admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "He ruined so much. He took so much from me. From you. But he's dying, Sarah. And I don't know if I can let him go without forgiving him." Sarah's heart ached at his words. She understood his conflict all too well. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easily, especially not after the damage that had been done. But at the same time, holding on to the anger was exhausting. It consumed every thought, every moment, leaving little room for anything else. "I've been struggling with the same thing," Sarah said quietly. "I don't know if I can forgive him either, but I also don't want to carry this anger around for the rest of my life." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with the same uncertainty. "Yeah," he murmured, "that's what I'm afraid of." They sat in silence for a long time after that, neither one knowing what the future held or how they would move forward. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now felt like a prison of memories and regrets. And as they sat there, side by side, they both knew that the hardest part was still to come. The following morning, Sarah awoke feeling as though the weight of the world had settled on her chest. The sunlight streaming through her bedroom window felt too bright, too out of place for the heaviness she carried inside. She had spent most of the night turning over Michael's words in her mind, his struggle with forgiveness, his lingering pain over his father's betrayal. It mirrored her own inner battle, a battle she wasn't sure she was ready to face. As she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair absent-mindedly, her thoughts kept circling back to one thing: James Walker. The man who had single-handedly torn apart her mother's life, who had destroyed whatever future she might have had with Michael. And now, that same man was lying on his deathbed, perhaps hoping for redemption. Could she forgive him? The question gnawed at her. The anger she felt toward him was justified. She knew that. But holding on to that anger was exhausting. Every step through the mansion felt like a reminder of what had been taken from her mother, from her. It had all become too much to carry, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could bear it. Determined to find some clarity, Sarah dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. She had to speak with James again. She had to face him one more time, if only to understand where she stood. Forgiveness wasn't something she was ready to offer, but perhaps she could at least get some kind of closure. As she approached James's room, her steps slowed. The heavy door loomed ahead, a barrier between her and the man who had caused so much pain. Sarah hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before gently pushing the door open. James lay in the same position as before, his body frail and still, his breathing shallow. The air in the room was thick, a mix of the scent of medication and the quiet finality of a man at the end of his life. Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding as she approached the bedside. For a moment, she thought he might be asleep. But then his eyes fluttered open, the faintest flicker of recognition crossing his face as he looked up at her. "Maria," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the sound of her mother's name. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she sat down in the chair beside the bed. "No," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not Maria. It's her daughter, Sarah." James blinked slowly, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "Sarah," he repeated, his voice weak. "I remember now." The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the machines keeping James comfortable. Sarah stared down at him, the anger she had been carrying for so long bubbling just beneath the surface. "I need to know why," she said, her voice trembling. "Why did you do it? Why did you take her away from me, from Michael?" James's breath hitched, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might not answer. But then he let out a long, shaky sigh, his eyes closing as if the weight of the past was too much to bear. "I thought I was protecting him," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "I thought, if she left, if she was gone, he would forget, move on, build the life I wanted for him." Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "You weren't protecting him," she said, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "You were controlling him. You took away his choice. You took away my mother's choice." James's eyes fluttered open again, and he looked at her with something resembling regret. I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know it would turn out like this." "You didn't care," Sarah shot back, her voice sharp. You didn't care about what happened to her, to me, to Michael. You only cared about your precious legacy." James's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, the guilt etched deeply into his face. "I cared. I cared about Michael. I thought I was doing what was best for him." Sarah shook her head, the anger giving way to sadness. "You were wrong," she said softly. "You ruined everything." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was filled with years of pain, of lost opportunities and broken lives. Sarah stared down at the frail man in the bed, feeling both pity and anger toward him. He was a shell of the man he once had been, and yet his actions had cast such a long shadow over her life, over Michael's life. "Is there anything you can say?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight. "That would make this right." James's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since she had entered the room, Sarah saw the depth of his remorse. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I wish I could take it all back." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. She wanted to scream, to tell him that his apology wasn't enough, that it could never be enough to fix what he had done. But looking at him now, seeing the raw vulnerability in his eyes, she realized that nothing he said could ever change the past. And maybe that was the point. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about absolving him of his actions. Maybe it was about freeing herself from the anger that had consumed her for so long. The anger that had kept her trapped in the past, just as much as James had trapped her mother. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she could forgive him, not fully, but she could let go of the anger. She could choose to move forward, to build a future that wasn't defined by the choices James Walker had made. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady, "but I can't hold on to this anymore. I need to move on." James nodded weakly, his eyes filled with tears. "I understand," he whispered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." The room was still, the tension between them finally breaking. Sarah stood up slowly, feeling lighter somehow, as though the weight she had been carrying for so long had started to lift. She looked down at James one last time, and in his eyes, she saw a man broken by his own mistakes. Without another word, she turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. The pain was still there, the loss still sharp, but it no longer controlled her. She had made her decision. Sarah stepped out of James's room, her mind spinning with the weight of their conversation. The hallway seemed longer than before, the walls closing in as she walked. But despite the intensity of what had just happened, she felt lighter. She hadn't forgiven James completely. She wasn't sure if she ever would, but letting go of some of the anger had given her space to breathe. She could finally begin to think about the future, rather than being trapped in the past. As she reached the end of the hallway, she heard voices coming from the living room. Curiosity piqued. Sarah moved closer and saw Michael sitting on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, deep in conversation with his lawyer. The lawyer's briefcase was open on the table, filled with documents that looked far more important than Sarah cared to know about. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should interrupt, but something inside her urged her forward. Michael looked up as she approached, his eyes immediately locking onto hers. He offered a small, tired smile, dismissing the lawyer with a quick nod. The lawyer gathered his papers, murmuring something about following up, and then exited the room, leaving Sarah and Michael alone. "You look different," Michael said, his brow furrowing slightly as he stood up. Sarah blinked, surprised by the comment. "Different how?" "I don't know," Michael replied, tilting his head as if he were trying to figure out the exact words. "Like, lighter, I guess." Sarah let out a soft laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. "I just spoke with your father." Michael's expression shifted, concern flashing in his eyes. "What did he say?" Sarah took a deep breath, stepping closer. "He apologized," she said quietly. "He admitted everything, and he told me he was sorry." Michael's jaw tightened, and he looked away, running a hand through his hair. "He's sorry," he echoed, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Sorry doesn't erase the years we've lost. Sorry doesn't bring back your mother or fix what he did." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the anger beneath his words. "I know, but..." It was all he had left to offer. Michael was silent for a moment, the tension in his body palpable. Then he let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. "I guess I should be relieved he admitted it," he muttered, "but I'm not. I just feel... empty." Sarah stepped closer, her heart aching for him. She had felt that same emptiness, had lived with it for so long, and now she could see it reflected in Michael's eyes. The man she had come to know, despite all their complicated history, was suffering just as much as she was. "You don't have to forgive him," Sarah said softly. "I don't know if I can either, but I had to let go of the anger. It was eating me alive." Michael glanced at her, a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. "How did you do it? How did you let go?" Sarah thought for a moment, searching for the right words. "I realized that holding on to all that pain, it was only hurting me, not him. And if I kept holding on to it, I'd never be able to move forward. I'd be stuck in the past, just like he was." Michael nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I've been stuck in the past for so long," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to move forward from here." Sarah sat down on the couch beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You don't have to do it alone, Michael," she said, her voice steady. "We're in this together now." Michael's eyes softened as he looked at her, and for a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to ease. The unspoken bond they had forged over the last few weeks, the shared pain, the shared history, was stronger now than ever before. And as they sat there, side by side, Sarah felt a sense of connection that she hadn't realized she'd been longing for. "I've been thinking a lot about my father," Michael said after a long pause. "About whether I should forgive him, or if I even can. But I've also been thinking about my mother, and your mother." Sarah tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" Michael leaned back against the couch, his gaze distant. "Our mothers didn't get the lives they deserved," he said quietly. "They were robbed of something, of love, of choice. And I don't want that to be our story, too." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at his words. She hadn't expected him to speak so openly, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the desire for something more than just the pain that had defined their shared past. "I don't want that either," she admitted, her voice soft. Michael turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I don't know where we go from here," he said slowly, "but I do know that I want to try. I want to find out what our future looks like, without all the baggage from our families hanging over us." Sarah's chest tightened with a mixture of emotions: hope, fear, uncertainty. The idea of moving forward with Michael, of leaving behind the pain of the past, was both terrifying and exhilarating. But deep down, she knew that he was right. They had both been carrying the weight of their parents' choices for too long, and it was time to break free. "I want that too," Sarah said, her voice steady. "But it's going to take time." Michael smiled, a small, genuine smile that lit up his tired features. "I can wait," he said softly, "as long as we do it together." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the tension that had once hung between them slowly dissolving. Sarah leaned back against the couch, feeling a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. There was still so much to process, so many unanswered questions about their future. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. Michael reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The simple gesture sent a warmth through her chest, and she squeezed his hand in return. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough. A sign that they were both ready to move forward, even if it was one step at a time. As they sat there, hand in hand, the sun began to set outside the large windows, casting a warm golden light across the room. The mansion, once a place of secrets and sorrow, now felt like a place of possibility, of new beginnings. Sarah glanced over at Michael, her heart swelling with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. They were both scarred, both broken in their own ways. But together, they could heal. Together, they could create a future that was theirs, not dictated by the choices of the past. And for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find happiness. The next few days at the mansion passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. The heaviness that had hung over the Walker estate for so long seemed to have lifted just slightly, as if the house itself were preparing for the inevitable end. James's condition had worsened, and everyone knew that his time was running out. Michael spent more time in his father's room, sitting silently by his bedside, his thoughts swirling with everything he had learned. He wasn't sure how to feel about his father's impending death. There was still so much unresolved between them, so much pain that had yet to be dealt with. But one thing had become clear to Michael. He needed to make a decision about forgiveness. It wasn't just for his father, it was for himself. The weight of carrying so much anger and resentment had been crushing him for years. And now, standing at the edge of his father's life, he realized that he didn't want to carry it any longer. He couldn't keep holding on to the past if he ever wanted to build a future, for himself, and possibly for Sarah. On the third day after Sarah's conversation with James, Michael made up his mind. He would talk to his father one last time. He didn't know if forgiveness was fully within his grasp, but he needed to confront the man who had shaped so much of his life, for better or worse. He needed to find some kind of closure. That afternoon, Michael stood outside his father's room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The mansion was quiet, as it had been for days, the staff moving about in hushed tones, as if the very walls knew that the end was near. Michael took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come, and pushed the door open. James lay in his bed, his body frail and sunken into the sheets, his breathing shallow and labored. His eyes were closed, and for a moment, Michael wondered if he was already too late. But then James's eyelids fluttered, and he turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Michael's. Michael. James's voice was barely a whisper, raspy and weak. Michael stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled a chair up to the bedside and sat down, staring at the man who had caused so much destruction in his life. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt almost unbearable, filled with the weight of all the years of unspoken anger and regret. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice low but steady. "For everything you did, for taking Maria away, for making all those choices for me without ever asking what I wanted." James's breath hitched, and he closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face. "I know," he whispered. "I never should have. I thought I was doing the right thing." Michael shook his head, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "But you weren't. You took away the one person I ever really loved. You made me think she left because of me, because I wasn't enough." Tears welled in James's eyes, and his chest rose and fell unevenly as he struggled to speak. "I'm so sorry, Michael," he rasped. "I was wrong. I see that now, but I didn't realize. I didn't know how much I'd hurt you." Michael looked away, his jaw clenched. The anger he had carried for so long still simmered beneath the surface. But there was something else now, a deep, aching sadness for the man lying before him. His father, the once powerful James Walker, was now nothing more than a frail, dying old man, broken by his own mistakes. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you," Michael said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm tired of hating you. I'm tired of carrying all of this around. It's been eating away at me for years, and I can't do it anymore." James's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded slowly, his breathing labored. "You don't have to forgive me," he whispered. "I don't deserve it. But I'm glad you're here." The silence between them stretched out once more, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of before. It was softer, almost peaceful, as if something between them had shifted. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you think it was okay to take everything away from me like that?" James closed his eyes, his brow furrowing as he struggled to answer. "I was afraid," he admitted after a long pause. "I was afraid that Maria, that she wasn't right for you, that she would distract you from what you were supposed to do, from the legacy I wanted you to carry on." Michael shook his head, his heart aching. "You didn't think I could decide that for myself." James's eyes opened again, and he looked at Michael with a mixture of regret and sorrow. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was push you away." Michael's throat tightened, and he blinked back tears. "You did," he said quietly. "You pushed me away for years, and now it's too late." James's breath caught, and a single tear slid down his cheek. "I know," he murmured. "I'm so sorry, Michael. For everything." Michael stared at him for a long moment, his heart heavy with the weight of all the years they had lost. And yet, sitting here now, watching his father in his final moments, Michael realized that holding on to the anger wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring Maria back, and it wouldn't fix the past. "I can't forget what you did," Michael said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't keep hating you either." James's lips trembled, and he let out a shaky breath. "That's all I can ask for," he whispered. Michael stood up, his heart pounding as he looked down at his father. "Goodbye, Dad," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. James closed his eyes, a peaceful expression settling over his face. "Goodbye, son," he whispered, his voice fading. Michael turned and walked out of the room, his chest tight with the finality of it all. He had made his peace, as much as he could, and now, all that was left was to figure out how to move forward. As he stepped into the hallway, he found Sarah waiting for him, her eyes filled with understanding. Without a word, she reached out and took his hand, offering him the support he hadn't realized he needed. They stood there together in silence, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a sense of release. The past was still there, a part of him, but it no longer held him captive. He had finally let go. The days after James Walker's death were quieter than Sarah had expected. The mansion, once filled with the whispers of secrets and unresolved pain, seemed to breathe differently now. The oppressive weight that had hung over it for so long had lifted, replaced with a stillness that felt almost peaceful. James was gone, and with him, the burden of the past that had controlled both Michael and Sarah's lives for so many years. The funeral was small and private, attended only by close family and a few of the household staff who had been with the Walkers for decades. Michael had insisted on keeping it low-key, not wanting the grandeur of the Walker name to overshadow the complicated emotions tied to his father's death. There were no speeches, no grand displays of grief, just a quiet goodbye. As the service came to an end, Sarah found herself standing beside Michael at the edge of the grave. The sky was overcast, a soft drizzle falling from the gray clouds above. She glanced at him, watching the way he stared down at the casket, his expression unreadable. She knew that while his father's death had closed one chapter, the pain of the past would take longer to heal. "You okay?" Sarah asked softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Michael didn't respond right away. He stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the grave as if waiting for some final sign, some resolution that might never come. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's strange. For so long, I wanted to hate him. I wanted to hold on to that anger because it was easier than admitting how much he hurt me." He paused, glancing at Sarah. "But now that he's gone, it's like I don't know who I am without that anger." Sarah nodded, understanding all too well what he meant. She had spent so much of her life angry at the world for taking her mother from her, for leaving her with so many unanswered questions. And now, with those questions finally answered, she, too, felt a strange sense of loss. What came next, after all the pain had been laid bare? "You're more than just your past, Michael," Sarah said gently. "We both are. It's going to take time, but we don't have to carry this with us anymore." Michael turned to face her, his eyes softening. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, letting go of everything. "It's harder than I thought it would be." Sarah took a deep breath, letting the rain wash over her. "I know," she said softly, "but we can figure it out. Together." Michael studied her for a moment, his gaze searching hers as if looking for something. Reassurance, maybe, or a glimpse of hope. And then, slowly, he nodded. "Together," he echoed, his voice firm but filled with uncertainty. They stood there in the rain for a few moments longer before Michael finally turned away from the grave, gesturing for Sarah to follow him. The funeral had ended, but the future, as daunting as it seemed, was just beginning. Back at the mansion, the staff moved quietly, cleaning up after the funeral while giving Michael and Sarah their space. The rain had turned into a steady downpour, the windows streaked with water as the storm outside grew stronger. Inside, however, the atmosphere was calm. For the first time since Sarah had arrived, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. In the kitchen, Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Michael as they sat at the small table near the window. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came after a long storm, when the air was still but not oppressive. "What now?" Michael asked after a long sip of coffee, his eyes drifting to the rain outside. Sarah set her cup down, thinking about the question. It was a simple one, but the answer wasn't so clear. The future lay ahead of them, uncertain and wide open. But for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare her. "I think we start fresh," Sarah said finally. "Without the weight of everything that's happened. We find out who we are, without the shadows of our parents hanging over us." Michael nodded, though the look in his eyes suggested that he was still grappling with the enormity of it all. "That sounds easier said than done," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. Sarah smiled softly. "Yeah, it does. But I think we can do it." Michael studied her for a moment, a small, almost hesitant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I think you're right." They sat in silence for a few more moments, the rain tapping against the window like a gentle reminder of the world outside. Sarah could feel the shift between them, the slow but certain movement toward something new, something less defined by the past and more by the present. "So, what do you want to do now?" Michael asked, his voice lighter than it had been in days. Sarah laughed softly, leaning back in her chair. "Honestly, I'm not sure. I never thought I'd be standing here, in this house, after everything that's happened. But I think I want to start over, somewhere new." Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "New, huh? Like a new city?" Sarah shrugged, a playful smile on her lips. "Maybe, or maybe just a new chapter. I don't know. I just know that I don't want to be stuck in the past anymore." Michael nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never leaving hers. "I like the sound of that." The future still felt uncertain, but it no longer felt like a weight pressing down on them. There was room for hope now, room for something other than the pain that had defined their lives for so long. In the weeks that followed, Michael and Sarah began the process of clearing out the mansion. It wasn't easy. There were moments when old memories resurfaced, when the weight of the past threatened to pull them back. But each day, they made progress. They packed away the remnants of a life that no longer belonged to them, making room for something new. Michael made the decision to sell the estate. It was a difficult choice, but one that felt necessary. The mansion had too many ghosts, too many reminders of what had been lost. Letting go of it felt like the final step in letting go of his father's hold over him. As the movers arrived one afternoon, Sarah stood beside Michael on the front steps, watching as the last of the boxes were loaded into the truck. The house, once so imposing and filled with secrets, now stood empty, a shell of its former self. "You ready?" Sarah asked, glancing up at him. Michael nodded, his expression calm. "Yeah, I'm ready." They turned to leave, walking down the gravel driveway toward Sarah's car. The rain had stopped, and the sun was starting to break through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the grounds. It felt like a sign, like the universe was telling them that it was time to move forward. As they drove away from the mansion, neither of them looked back. The past was behind them now, and the future, whatever it held, was theirs to shape.